Thank you all very much for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to an audience like this, and how important I think what the organization here, what Chicago Science and Technology is doing, what their mission is, and in any way that I can helpfully support it at all, I'm quite happy to do so. So, unfortunately, I also have this book that came out, so Oxford Press decided it would be a good idea for me to come talk about it, and that's what I like to do. So I'm not really going to give a book talk in the sense of trying to pitch the book. I'm going to try and talk about some of the ideas that are in this newer book and also this older one, assuming that this works. Let's see, there it is. There's the new one. It's called Failure. So as you can see, I'm sort of carving a little niche out for myself here with championing ignorance and failure. But I do believe that, I hope to convince you today that knowing these things is really a great portal into understanding science and what the process of science is, especially in our modern world. And I'm going to go even a little further, and I hope, yes, there you go. And in addition to talking about ignorance and failure, I'm going to use those to frame the idea that we also should think about doubt and uncertainty, which are quite important to science as well. What I would like to say is that I'm going to try and put a nice face on those, make a little bit more of a party out of it, and tell you that ignorance, doubt, uncertainty, and failure are really the things that make science such a successful enterprise. We should recognize, I think, just for a moment, indeed how successful an enterprise it is. In the last 400 or so years, typically we think of the beginning of what we call modern or Western science at the moment to have started somewhere along the line with Galileo, say, in the mid-1600s. And so for the last 400 or so years, we've had this particular brand of science that has seen an exponential growth in knowledge and a tremendous pace of progress. Compared, for example, to the years before it, I mean, the example that I like to give is that the Bronze Age, which is a technological age, the Bronze Age lasted for 2,000 years. That means that 50 generations of human beings with brains no different from yours or mine were born, grew up, and died in precisely the same technology for 50 generations. We all know that we can't go more than a year without changing phones, operating systems, computers, cars, whatever it might be. And so you can see the incredibly rapid pace that science has taken over the last several years. And of course, this has a lot to do with how we think about it and how we keep up with it and what it means in society today. So I think science is undeniably extremely successful as a way, not the only way, but a way of understanding and explaining the world. And its remarkable success is something we should all be in awe of, in my opinion. So I'd like to start out with a phrase that, there we go, okay. So I'm actually using my iPhone as a remote tonight, and it's the first time I've done that, which is remarkable in itself, right? But I have my phone here as a remote control for the computer, and I don't know what's controlling me. So this is a phrase this is a kind of an anonymous saying that I think is really a very apt description of science in a way, that it's very difficult to find a black cat in a dark room, especially, I hope, especially when there is no cat. And it seems to me that this is a precise description of exactly how science really works. Scientists sort of stumble around in dark rooms looking for mysterious black cats, some of which have been reported to be there. The reports may be more or less reliable. There have been slight sightings. But it's always fumbling around in the dark and trying to piece together what's there. And if you do wind up discovering a cat, of course, the first thing you do is, well, put it out in a paper, get it in a textbook, and move on to the next dark room, because that's really what we care about. And so I'd like to suggest that science is not so much the way we typically think of it, is built on these great pillars of knowledge and objectivity, supporting fact and truth and all these glorious ideas, but really what I think we'll find is that science is really held up in many ways and powered by ignorance, that is by what we don't know, by failure, by what we try and know, and by using doubt and uncertainty at all times in the process. So this is a little different, I suppose, than what most people tend to think about science. If I can get this to go. Well, this was working really well earlier, okay. And that is something called the scientific method, which gets taught quite a lot in schools and which we all have heard about and believe is kind of what scientists do. I'd like to disabuse you of that idea. I'd like to tell you that I don't know any scientist who uses a method such as this. It's an okay description, it's really a kind of a shorthand, but it bears less and less reality to what actually goes on. So the notion is, of course, that you start out with some observation, you develop a hypothesis about whatever that thing is you've observed, you devise some experiment to test it, and then based on some new observations, you come up with a new hypothesis, or you revise that hypothesis. Maybe. I see, does it have to go that way, this way? I wonder if it's the Wi-Fi that's the problem. Okay. And this goes on sort of ad nauseum, as it were. Here's what I don't like about the scientific method. The first thing I don't like about it is the word method. I think it gives a false idea of how science works. There is no method in science. I wish there were. I wish there were a set of rules, I suppose, and I could just follow them, and I could put stuff in the hopper, turn the crank, and out would fall gadgets and cures and data and all the rest of that sort of stuff. But I don't know of any real method that does that. I don't know of a recipe. In point of fact, science is a very creative act. When done properly, it requires intuition, it requires thought, it requires a lot of guesswork, and it requires a lot of team effort. And so there's no just simple recipe or method. The other problem with the scientific method, as it's often taught, is this notion that, sorry, this worked so well earlier, there you go, that you go through this panel of stuff, and it's all fairly straightforward. I mean, it's pretty easy to say observation, make up an experiment, do an experiment, and then do some more observation. But the very thing that's really the core of the scientific, making up a hypothesis, well, it really has nothing to say about that. I mean, how do you do that? How do you make up a hypothesis? What do? Do you go to the catalog there and pick one or two of them that look good in the book of hypotheses? So the very creative moment in science, the very act of really working it out, of trying to figure out what's going on, is just make a hypothesis. I mean, that's kind of, to me, like giving somebody a brush and some paint and say, go do some art. So it doesn't really get you anywhere, it seems to me. So this difference, this disconnect, as it were, between the way science is pursued and the way it's perceived, I think, commonly, first came to my attention, I suppose, because I teach a course at Columbia, in addition to running a laboratory, and I teach a course with a rather forbidding name, Cellular and Molecular Neuroscience 1. So there's 2 of these, in fact. And this is a very long course. It's 25 lectures, full of facts, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say. We use a textbook, if I can get that out, called Principles of Neuroscience by 3 eminent neurobiologists. I should tell you that this textbook is 1,414 pages long. It weighs in at a remarkable, 7.6 pounds. 7.6 pounds of textbook. Just to put that in some perspective, 7.6 pounds is about twice the weight of a human brain. So here we have a textbook about the brain that actually weighs twice as much as the one sitting inside your head. I thought, this can't be right. I mean, I'm afraid that by the end of this course and by the end of reading this book, these students have the idea that pretty much everything is known about neuroscience in the brain. That's clearly not the case. And they might also have the idea that the purpose of science and the purpose of neuroscientists working in laboratories is to churn out a bunch of facts and fill up these horrible books with them that they then have to memorize and puke back up on an exam. And that's not the case either. That's not what we do. I mean, when scientists go to a conference, I've been all week at this conference here in Chicago called the Annual Meeting for the Society for Neuroscience. Believe it or not, 33,000 neuroscientists from all over the world came to this meeting. It's very depressing in some ways, really. I mean, 33,000, really? Am I going to get a grant funded here? But 33,000 people come to this meeting. Yes, they present data. Yes, we look at data and all the rest of that. But really, we don't sit around and talk about what we know. We go to the bar afterwards, we have a beer, and we talk about what we don't know, what we need to find out, what needs to be, what are the next steps, what are the important questions? Why should we find this out rather than that first? What's the priorities? What didn't we know 20 years ago we still don't know, and why don't we know it? And if we do get to know this, what will we get to know next? What will we do next? So these are the really important things that I think actually get talked about. This is encapsulated in a favorite quote of mine from Madame Curie, Marie Curie, winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, and this comes from a letter that she wrote to her brother after obtaining, mind you, her 2nd graduate degree in science, in which she says, one never notices what has been done, one only can see what remains to be done. And I thought, well, it's what remains to be done. That's precisely it. This is what we need to communicate, because this is where science takes place, on the what remains to be done. I should say before passing, this picture is one of my favorite pictures of Marie Curie, because I am in fact convinced that that glow behind her is not in fact a photographic effect. It's the real thing. It is true, I have to say, that her papers, her notebooks to this day are stored in a basement room in the Bibliothèque Française in Paris, and it's a concrete room that's also lead lined, and if you're a scholar and want to go work on the notebooks, you have to put on a radiation suit because they're so hot. So not did she do some amazing science, but it was tremendous courage. I think sometimes we forget how important courage is in doing science. So let me then, I hope, I'm going back to the old style of, maybe it just has to be out of the way here. Okay. So let me disabuse you a little bit of this idea of science that I think is common, which is that scientists are putting pieces together into a puzzle, that we're finishing up a puzzle, that there's some ultimate answer, and that this is what we busily do. We just pick up puzzle pieces, we get new pieces, and we stick them in these puzzles. I mean, first of all, I have to say, with a puzzle, the manufacturer has guaranteed that there's a solution. That's not really the case in the real world, it seems to me, regardless of what you may think about a manufacturer or otherwise. So we don't really know what the solution is, or if there is one, or if there is ultimately any such thing. So I don't think this is really the case. I think it's more like an image that has been around for a while. A number of people have used this image. If you think of this sort of white circle in the middle as being knowledge in a sea of darkness of all the stuff we don't know, the black part is the ignorance. Well, as our knowledge increases, as the circle gets larger, recognize, of course, that the circumference gets larger too. It gets larger by a well-known formula, 2 pi r. And so that part of our knowledge that's in touch with ignorance also grows. So as knowledge grows, so does our awareness of the ignorance. And in fact, an even better model for this might be in 3 dimensions. If you think of knowledge as a sphere bobbing around in the darkness of ignorance, well, then it actually grows. The circumference of that sphere, the outside of that sphere, the area of the sphere in touch with ignorance, actually grows as the square of the radius times pi. So the notion is that as knowledge grows, also so does ignorance, so does what we don't know. I'll try and develop that theme a little bit more. But let me also make a statement here about ignorance. I say ignorance, and I use the word ignorance, of course, to be, at least in part, intentionally provocative. But I don't mean it in any of the sort of nefarious and bad ways that ignorance can have a meaning. I don't mean stupidity, I don't mean a callow indifference to fact, I don't mean being overly opinionated. I mean the kind of ignorance that was stated by, yes, James Clerk Maxwell, perhaps the greatest physicist between Newton and Einstein, who said that thoroughly conscious ignorance is the prelude to every great advance in science. So thoroughly conscious ignorance is the kind of ignorance we really want to talk about, I think. And I think what that means is that we can sort of turn this idea around. I think we typically think that we start not knowing something, and then we go to school, or we read a book, or we do this, or whatever, in order to gain some knowledge. And that's fine in a way, but I think it also works just the opposite way as well. That what do you do with that knowledge once you get it? You go from knowledge to increase your ignorance in quality. So we often don't think about the quality of ignorance, but there's low quality ignorance and there's high quality ignorance. There's bad stuff and there's good stuff. Scientists argue about this all the time. Sometimes we call them bull sessions, sometimes we call them grant proposals, but whatever, this is what we argue about, is what's the high quality ignorance. So what knowledge enables you to do is to derive a more sophisticated kind of ignorance, a better set of questions than the ones you had before. Indeed, we could say that it's not just ignorance, rather, but it's the notion that knowledge creates questions. A good example of this comes from the famous physicist I.I. Rabi, who was at Columbia University. I never knew Rabi, he passed away before I got there, but I know many people who did know him. And I've heard this account firsthand, and apparently a story that he liked to tell. I should point out that Robbie won the Nobel Prize in 1944 for the development of nuclear magnetic resonance, which is not only still useful in chemistry laboratories, but of course eventually turned into magnetic resonance imaging, a crucial diagnostic tool in medicine. So Robbie used to tell the story about when he would come home from school. He was an immigrant child growing up on the Lower East Side of New York. He and his friends would come home from school, and all his friends' mothers would ask them, how did you do in school today? How are things in school, and so forth. But Mrs. Robbie's mother, always asked him, so Isidore, did you ask any good questions today? And I think that's the real key. I think Mrs. Robbie had the right idea, and that's why I think Izzy won the Nobel Prize, to tell you the truth. So, because it's the questions really that make a difference. This is also reflected in a wonderful quote from George Bernard Shaw. This was part of a dinner toast, believe it or not, to Albert Einstein at some party that was being thrown in his honor, in which he said, science is always wrong, never solves a problem without creating 10 more, which I find kind of glorious because it's really good for job security, if nothing else. Actually, it seems he cribbed that idea from Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, who came up with this idea of question propagation, that every answer on principle begets a fresh question. Shaw simply increased it by an order of magnitude to 10 questions, and I think he was probably, in fact, correct. So this is the notion then that I think is important, that science, and I would say art and much of scholarship, is really the search for better ignorance, for a higher quality ignorance, for a more sophisticated set of questions. This is very nicely wrapped up in a phrase called negative capability. Negative capability is a phrase that was coined by the poet John Keats in a letter to his brother, in fact, in which he said, of negative capability, it was a state when a man, or a woman I hope we now believe, is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. He considered this to be the ideal creative state. So I'm not sure that scientists aren't irritable about fact and reason, but still the idea is that you can remain and understand that there are mysteries, there are uncertainties, and this is the play space that we work in. This is where we want to be, in fact. And we needn't be irritable and awful about it. We needn't worry about, well, what do we know? I mean, don't we know this? We got to get to know this, because that's not where the creativity is. Similar phrase, but for the scientist, I guess, was used by Erwin Schrödinger, who knew something about cats, you know, the Schrödinger's cat equation. He knew something about black cats, I guess, in which he said, in an honest search for knowledge, you quite often have to abide by ignorance for an indefinite period. I think that's a critical idea, this notion of abiding by ignorance in order to get somewhere else. So, I'm sorry, I should mention to you, you may have noticed already that I like to use a lot of quotes. I don't use this really for purposes of authority or to convince you that anything's right necessarily. I just think if somebody said something clever about this, they shouldn't be not left out of the conversation just because they're dead, I suppose, but we should still hear from them. And secondly, I think it's very important for us to realize that the conversation is not brand new. This conversation has been going on for quite some time and will go on, I hope, for quite some time after us, and it's just our pleasure to be able to join into it. So using that, I'll use this character for my next quote. I know he doesn't really belong in this pantheon, but this is Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense during the ill-begotten campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq post 9/11. But he said this thing that I think is actually quite true and quite clever. He wasn't actually the first person to say it, but he is the most, oh, sorry, now I have to go back. I don't know if I can go back. Well, all right, so I won't, yeah, there it is. But he's the most recent and the most notorious, and what he was talking about, this was in testimony before Congress about things that we didn't know we were getting into there and all the rest of that. But what he was really worried about were the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know. And he was widely ridiculed for this statement, but it's actually very thoughtful. It's actually very clever and very important. And I think that's where failure comes in. So I'm using this as a way to sort of segue into the notion of failure, which I'm putting up here in nice green letters because instead of putting it up in red letters, I consider failure to be a very positive and good thing. Here's one more quote, I guess, on failure from one of our founding fathers and arguably the first scientist in America, Benjamin Franklin, who noticed that the history of errors of mankind, all things considered, is more valuable and more interesting than that of their discoveries, because success, after all, is uniform, but error is endlessly differentiated and diversified. This is similar to a phrase that Tolstoy used in Anna Karenina, sometimes called the Anna Karenina principle. That's why he wrote about unhappy families. He said, well, happy families are all happy in pretty much the same way, but unhappy families are unhappy in a myriad of ways, making them infinitely more interesting. And I think that's the case with failure as well. It's just the second law of thermodynamics, frankly. There are only a few ways to be right, and there's a god-awful number of ways to be wrong or to fail, and many of them are actually quite interesting. Some of them don't work out. Here's one of my favorite. Here's a failure that, for those of you who own either a cat or a dog, will recognize. You can ring a bell all you want, and you're not going to get a cat to do anything for you. But a dog, of course, will salivate all over the place if you put some food in front of their face. So sometimes you can set yourself up for failure, of course. So, yeah, this is a great quote also from Niels Bohr. Success is learning. Oh, no, actually, I don't like these quotes. I'm going to give you a set of quotes that I don't think are the kind of failure we want to talk about. So there are a whole bunch of aphorisms about failure out there. Here's two of them. Success is learning to fail again and again with no lack of enthusiasm. That's often attributed to Winston Churchill. He, in fact, did not say that. Fail hard, fail fast is a favorite in the tech industry these days. I've discovered 10,000 ways that don't work. Thomas Edison reportedly said that before he invented the light bulb. Maybe it's true, I'm not sure. Failure is the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. I mean, these things are all somehow true. Here's one from a Chinese fortune cookie in a Chinese restaurant that I picked up. Failure is opportunity in disguise. And this is a wonderful quote from the actress Gloria Swanson. If you're 40 years old and never had a failure, you've been deprived. Not sure what she had in mind there. But what I'd like to say is that although these are all important ideas about failure, if you're on the phone with somebody who's just failed in love or sport or academics or something like that, they have nothing to do with the kind of failure I want to talk about in science. Because the kind of failure I want to talk about in science is the fact that we gain knowledge of our ignorance through failure. It's through failure that we learn about what we didn't know, if you will. I'm going to use Enrico Fermi here, another famous physicist, who used to tell his students that if you perform an experiment and it proves the hypothesis, you've made a measurement. But if you do an experiment and it fails to prove the hypothesis, you've made a discovery. I find that kind of interesting. Now, I think it's important to recognize that both measurement and discovery are important in science. I wouldn't say just one or the other, but it is interesting that you can succeed in an experiment and you get a measurement, or you can fail in an experiment and you've made a discovery. Both work in science. All right, so if that's the case, one question we might ask ourselves is how much failure? I mean, you can't fail 100% of the time, I don't think. You have to succeed now and again. So how much failure? The reason I bring this up is that I think we actually underestimate the amount of failure that's acceptable. That we could fail a whole lot more than we do and it would be okay. We would still be doing quite good. So I'll use, as a simple example, I could give you a couple of dozen of them, and there are a couple dozen of them in the book, but let me use these examples here from nature. So these are pictures of animals who are all the kings of whatever their niche is, right? The lions are the king of the jungle, the shark and the killer whale, king of the oceans, king of the skies, the tigers, etc. These are all the top of the food chain. Every one of these animals is, the best there is, as it were. And you might think that any time they get a little hungry, they just go out and bag themselves a little snack and everything is fine. But in point of fact, when you look at the predator-prey literature, you find that these animals are actually successful in actually bringing down some critter for lunch or dinner, fewer than 7% of the tries. So on fewer than 7% of their attempts do they actually manage to bag a prey animal. And of course they do that mostly by hunting around the edge of the herd, the old and the sick and the slow and so forth. If you want to get something really young and juicy, your percentages go really far down. So the point of the matter is that they actually have a success rate that's only 7%, and yet we consider them the top of the top, the best that evolution has to offer. So I think we can put up with a great deal more failure than we think of. I had a baseball metaphor, but I'm not sure it might be sensitive to be mentioning that here tonight, my being from New York, so I'll skip over it. But as you know, baseball players get paid a great deal of money to fail most of the time. If they manage a 300 batting average, which means they're failing 70% of the time, they're making an awful lot of money. And of course, we enjoy failure. We actually set ourselves up for failure in many ways. There's what I think is a cool cartoon from the New Yorker about golf, you know. I mean, golf is a silly game. It only works because the hole's not so big, right? Of course, it would be more fun if you made a smaller hole. There's a wonderful routine that Robin Williams, the late Robin Williams, does on the game of golf, in which he explains the rules of the game of golf. It's quite hilarious because all he does is highlight why it's so ridiculously difficult, using a curved little stick and a tiny little ball and a hole that's 300 yards away. And I should warn you before you go listen to it on the web where it is, that it's also laced with a lot of salty language. But aside from that, it's quite hysterical as a description. So what shall we say about failure? Here is a quote, in fact, from Niels Bohr, that an expert he defines as a person who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. Not a person who knows something, knows all there is to know in a very narrow field, because really, no one knows all there is to know, even in a very narrow field, because there's always something more to know. There's always something we don't know. But if you've made all the possible mistakes in a very narrow field, you truly are an expert. Now this gets on to, I want to sort of straighten something out here a little bit. You quite often hear about serendipity in science, and it's another phrase that I actually don't kind of like, although it's very common and it's often thought of as a good thing. And that's the notion that, a lot of science depends on serendipity, this notion that we kind of get to things by accident. Now there is a notion of accident and failure. You go do something, it fails, it doesn't work, but lo and behold, you see something different. I think Isaac Asimov has a wonderful statement. He says, what any scientist really wants to hear when they look at data is not eureka, but, oh, that's weird, because that tells you there's something more there than you even thought there was. So the trouble with serendipity is that it's often ascribed to many scientific discoveries were made, quote, by accident. And they're not really made by accident. They're made by people who work very hard and are smart enough to recognize that when something fails, it's telling you something. So lawyers don't make serendipitous scientific discoveries. Accountants don't make serendipitous scientific discoveries. They do what they do. Only scientists really make serendipitous scientific discoveries. Louis Pasteur, who made a lot of serendipitous scientific discoveries, actually, or was the beneficiary of a certain amount of serendipity, but a lot of failure, claimed that chance favors the prepared mind. And I think that's right, that things don't just happen to you by luck. You have to be prepared in some way to accept the failure and see that there's something in it. In fact, I'd say my corollary to this is failure also favors the prepared mind. And it's a good idea to prepare your mind for failure, because that's what it will get. All right, so we have ignorance. We have doubt that I haven't talked about too much, but I will in a bit or when we discuss things. We have uncertainty. We have failure. It's not sounding so good. So what does this all lead to? I guess you could say it might lead to despair and a bad habit. So an existential habit of despair. But in point of fact, that's not what really happens. We don't find that these things in science lead to despair. They lead rather, I don't know if this animation is going to work, and I'm not even sure it should. Oh, look at that, it works. They lead instead to, I think, creativity. These are exactly the places where creativity occurs in science. It's very important to recognize this. But my worry is, and this is the worry I think of the Center for Science and Technology here, is this something that is only, if you will, for the expert to know? So we don't teach ignorance, doubt, uncertainty, and failure in high school science or even in college science. You don't learn about this stuff until you get to become a graduate student or a working scientist. And so should this be restricted to simply to experts, that only expert scientists know about this? I don't think so. I think this is a way that, in fact, we can all understand science. I think it's important to realize I'm a biologist, I'm a neuroscientist, I know a certain amount about the brain. There are 16,000 presentations, posters, and talks that were given at this neuroscience conference. I can tell you that I could understand and appreciate fewer than 1% of them, well fewer than 1% of them. So I'm not the smartest guy in the world either. I'm never going to understand all of neuroscience, and that doesn't even include physics and chemistry and many other things that I have no better understanding than anybody else who hasn't been trained in those fields. But I can appreciate them. I think I can come to enjoy them because the questions they ask are still really interesting. So what can we say? Scientific progress generates ignorance. It generates uncertainty, doubt, failure. But here's the important thing. Ignorance is not the same thing as stupidity. Uncertainty is not unreliability. I'll explain this more in a moment if you wish. Doubt is not just suspicion, and failure is not a question of being wrong. In fact, I think we could redefine these things in a way for science, where we see that ignorance really is an opportunity. What we don't know is an opportunity to find out more, to experiment more. Uncertainty actually is a kind of a confidence. So the word uncertainty is very dangerous, I find, because in common parlance it means one thing. It means kind of, yeah, you don't know. It's a shrug of the shoulders or something. But in science, that's not the case. Scientists use uncertainty as a quantifiable variable. We understand uncertainty in some ways and can work with it. You talk about a confidence level, you talk about a p-value, a statistical significance. All of these things have a certain level of uncertainty, and we can measure and label that uncertainty and put it somewhere. Work around it, work with it, et cetera, et cetera. And so uncertainty actually is a way of measuring confidence. Doubt, well, you might not think doubt is a good thing, but the alternative is authority. I mean, are we just going to believe whatever's been passed down over the ages? That is indeed how much of science worked for a long time. Before Galileo, and his well-known story of his sort of attempt to go against the authority of the church and the general beliefs of the day, that it was the sun that went around the earth and so forth, this was how science was done. There were authorities and things got handed down. Aristotle, as you probably know, is the greatest authority in all of history, also wrong about almost 95% of everything he ever suggested or said. Nothing wrong with that, he tried his best, but for many, many years, science was really held back. All through medieval Europe, science was essentially held back because if you went against Aristotle, that was no good. So doubt was not accepted, and so all you have left then is authority. And then there's failure, of course, which I think gives you a kind of reliability. So failure, if you're not failing enough, then you can't really feel that the work is reliable. As they say, if you keep hitting the bullseye, the target must be too close. So you've rigged it, you know. If people continue to be successful in everything they do, then they've rigged it. They're asking simple questions that are not really of any importance. So failure actually, I think, produces a kind of integrity, a kind of a reliability. The most important thing to get out of this is the recognition that unsettled science is not the same thing as unsound science. And this is a crucial idea because, as you well know, there are nefarious actors, shall we say, in areas like climate control or tobacco and all of these things, who will tell you that, well, the science isn't really settled, the science doesn't really tell you this or that, there is disagreement and so forth and so on. But they would suggest to you then that because it's unsettled, it's unsound. That's not true. I mean, I think the climate issue is a very good issue. I don't want to take a political position on what we should do about the climate issue, but I think the science is undeniable that anthropocentric activity is changing the climate. Now, we may decide that we'll live with that and that'll be okay. That's a political, social decision to make. But the science is clear. Now, the problem is, of course, 90% of the science is agreed upon by all climate scientists. There's about 3% of it that you could say there's reasonable disagreement. But of course, what everybody is interested in is the 3% because that's all scientists talk about. There's no reason for us to talk about, in our opinion, the 97% we agree on. So everybody talks about the 3% we don't agree on. We have big arguments about it. And the public, the politicians, industry, whatever, look on and say, well, look, these guys can't agree on anything. That's not really true. They agree on almost everything. So let me end this with this notion of pluralism, which I think is a crucial thing to bring back to science because we've begun to move away from it. This is a picture of Isaiah Berlin, who was a philosopher of the 20th century, mostly a historian and philosopher of culture and politics. But he came up with this notion, well, he was a proponent of this idea of pluralism. And he wrote a book, which he was most famous for. It was actually a rather small book called The Fox and the Hedgehog. And it's based on an old quote from a Greek poet, which says, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And Berlin's book was an attempt to sort of classify people. It was actually a critique on Tolstoy, but he then used it to classify people as either being foxes or hedgehogs. Do you just, get one big idea? Do you know one big thing and that's what you go after? Or are you kind of foxy about things, a lot of little things and you do this and that? Of course, everybody, even as Berlin realized, everybody has a bit of both in them, and science too is both foxy and hedgehoggy. But you have to be careful not to let it get too hedgehoggy, I would say. So Berlin's idea was value pluralism, not so much anything goes, it's not relativism, it's not, oh yeah, everybody belongs in the party, but many things should go, many incommensurable things, as he put it, things that don't necessarily seem like they can't both be right, should nonetheless be pursued at the same time. Even if at some point one of the things will turn out to be right and the other will turn out to be wrong, it's a good idea quite often to pursue parallel pathways. When a camper is lost on a field trip or whatever, the strategy is not to send a search party all out in one direction. You fan out, because that's the greatest likelihood of finding the camper, even though the camper, of course, is indeed in one position, although an unknown position. So the strategy is to fan out, to try many different strategies, and not just put everybody off in one direction, where the chance of finding the camper is actually smaller, I think. Yes. So I would say this is a kind of I think a question that comes up a lot. What is it that's changed between the public and science? What is it that's changed between the public's image of science, scientists' ability to communicate science to the public? What are the things that have changed? And I would say that science is at a kind of an inflection point in modern society. I guess to some extent we always all believe that we're living in some inflection point or transitional age, but I think there's a good reason to believe it here. I think in its earliest days, Newton, Galen, Vesalius, the anatomist, Michael Faraday, early science had to be based at least partly on a kind of hubris and faith that what they were finding out, what they were looking for, were ultimate answers. They really were answers. They really were looking for the idea that there would be a single explanation about the universe that we could somehow or another grasp, and the faith that there was a creator and that his creation could be apprehended. And indeed, a great deal of early science, the purpose of it was to apprehend the creator better by understanding the creation. So these were the ideas that propelled much of early science. Now, I would say science has reached a kind of a maturity, and it no longer needs the hubris or faith to propel it along, to give it the confidence to move along. I think we can afford now to be humble, to appreciate the immensity of our remaining ignorance, the depth of our uncertainty, and the likelihood of continued failures. All of this in a process that we can also confidently say is historically and empirically far and away the best way we currently have of understanding the universe and everything that's in it. And so it's this inflection point that I think scientists know implicitly, but have failed to make an explicit and good case for among the, let us say, general public, if you will. So let me end with this statement about pluralism from an American philosopher, Charles Peirce. I know it looks like it's spelled Pierce, but he actually pronounced it Peirce, who claimed that science is not like a chain, only as strong as the proverbial weakest link, but rather it's like a cable made up of many delicate strands that are intertwined and interrelated, and any few of them that may break or not hold up will not really significantly reduce the strength of the overall cable, and that this is the way science should be built. Let me tell you a story that I think, I'm going to end with this story, I promise, that I think exemplifies it. The story is about my dog, and it's about a young student named Tom who wrote an essay called My Dog. That's actually my dog. He's a Newfoundland named Orson. So Tom wrote an essay about my dog and handed it in, and the next day the teacher came back to him and said, Tom, your essay, My Dog, is exactly the same as your brother's. Did you copy it? To which Tom says, no, ma'am, it's the same dog. Now, of course, we realize immediately that there should still be two essays about the same dog. And indeed, that's the case with science. There's always a good reason to have more than one explanation for whatever the facts may seem to be. And then we'll see how they all turn out. This is from Rita Dove, U.S. Poet Laureate, for 2 years, 1993 to 1995, who says that failure is a favor to the future. And I think that's the way to look at it. Failure, it means there's more to do and there's more to be seen, and that's why we have young people. And we should continue to have young people failing away, as Samuel Beckett puts it, and learning how to fail better and better. So thank you all very much. I'd love to have a discussion about all of this and hear your ideas and your thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you want me to just ask for questions and choose whoever raises their hand? Okay, that's good. We can do that. Do you need a microphone out there? Or? I'll repeat the question. Yes, please.
One of the things that you mentioned there, or maybe it's not that important, that without curiosity, we go nowhere, and without curiosity, and most people are not curious. And so they take what is given to them
Yep.
the way that is given and accept it. That's one of the failures of this society.
So the comment and partial question is that I didn't mention curiosity, and that's true, I did not specifically mention curiosity, but I think it's, curiosity is a tricky thing, I have to say. In neuroscience, we have no idea where curiosity comes from. We have no idea why we should be curious, why other animals are curious, why we're curious. It's an interesting field all of its own, and very little written about it. What I would say, though, is that it's precisely things like failure and ignorance that are the fountain of curiosity. This is where curiosity comes from. And the doubt and uncertainty also continue to make us or support our curiosity. Because again, if you just take it as known, if you take it on authority, then yes, there's nothing to be curious about. So I think curiosity comes along with failure. Now, is everybody curious? No, there are people who are uncurious, I guess, and I don't know why. I can't imagine why you wouldn't be curious about almost everything that goes on in the world. But in general, I would say the first thing that, the thing that makes me most curious in the lab, as I said, this Isaac Asimov thing, is when I walk in the door and a graduate student comes up and says, I did this experiment, but this is not the result we were expecting. Well, then I think, okay, now we got to sit down and work on this. If they show me a result that I was expecting, I say, that's fabulous, let's get on with the next experiment. So that's where the curiosity comes from, I think.
But you notice that many of the young people left in the most important part, which is when you learn something from the interaction between the speaker and the question.
Yes. Well, they may have had somewhere to go.
There's some reason to look, I may be biased, but this is what I know.
Yes.
Curiosity is not abundant among humans.
So it's not abundant, and maybe that's part of what makes it valuable. It would be nice if it was more abundant, I agree, but you take what you get. Fortunately, enough of us seem to be curious to move things forward and to get things going. But I think people are more curious than you may give them credit for. Part of the problem is, what do you do with this curiosity? So after a while you stop being curious, because what do you do with it? We certainly don't teach it in school. We don't give credit for curiosity in school. Now, I'm not one of these people who blames our educational system for all the ills of society, that we take creative kids, curious kids, and turn them into adult drones that are uncurious and uninvolved and disengaged and all the rest of that. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think anybody in here is actually thinks they would have been better off without the education that they got, or that we could preserve childhood creativity and curiosity by keeping kids out of school. The people who I know who didn't get educated, who didn't get an education, I don't find them any more curious or creative in general than the rest of the population. So I don't think that's the problem, in spite of the fact that I do think our educational system does not emphasize curiosity, and that's a problem that we could fix. We could do better. But I don't think it's all harmful. I just think we could do better. They may have had somewhere to go, they could have had a class, or maybe they're just going to watch the ball game, I don't know. They could be curious about the uncertainty of the outcome, although I'm pretty certain of the outcome. Anybody else? Well, I must have said something that bothered you. Well, I'm happy to sit around and talk for a while. I'm supposed to go out here and sit at the book table. We can talk more sort of casually if you'd like then. Is that good? Do you want to, yes?
So if you want to buy a book, they're for sale in the hallway here. Dr. Firestein will be signing them at the table right there.
Oh, I'm going to sign them here. And then we can sit and talk about that as well. I mean, sit and talk while I'm signing them. I can do two things at once, sometimes. Sometimes. All right, well, thank you all very much. I certainly appreciate your attention. Thank you.